The ring wasn't hers to choose. The house wasn't hers to refuse. Even the name she was learning to answer to belonged to a man she had spoken to exactly 4 times before the wedding. Beatrice Langley had become Beatrice Whitfield on a Tuesday in October, in a church that smelled of old wood and her mother's anxiety, with a bouquet of late-season roses that someone else had selected, and a dress that had been her mother's idea of what a grateful daughter wore. She had been grateful. That was the honest thing she kept returning to in the months that followed. She had not been unhappy at the altar. She had been afraid, which was different, and she had been grateful, because Oliver Whitfield was not cruel, and in the arithmetic of arranged marriages in Harrow County, Virginia, in 1887, not cruel was a reasonable starting point. What she had not expected was the ledger. She found it 3 weeks into the marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon when Oliver was in Lynchburg on business, and she was attempting, carefully, to learn the geography of her own household. The study was the last room she'd tried. She had avoided it the way you avoided a room that didn't yet belong to you, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenton, had mentioned something about the household accounts, in a tone that suggested someone ought to be looking at them, and Beatrice had been keeping her own family's accounts since she was 17, so she took the key from the hook in the kitchen and went in. The ledger she found first was the one Oliver had given her a summary of before the wedding. Clean figures. Manageable numbers. A household running at a slight surplus, which was what her father had been told, which was what had made the match acceptable to everyone concerned. The second ledger was behind the first one, pushed to the back of the lower shelf, with the particular carelessness of something that was meant to stay unseen. She read it standing up, because she didn't think to sit down until she was 3 pages in, and by then her legs had already made their decision. The debt was not catastrophic. That was the first thing she told herself, because she was the kind of woman who looked for the true shape of a problem before she panicked about it. But it was real, and it was considerably larger than the comfortable fiction Oliver had presented, and it had been accumulating since before the match was arranged. Before her father had agreed. Before her father had been told the numbers that made him agree. She stood in the study of her husband's house, with her husband's hidden ledger in her hands, and she thought about her father shaking Oliver Whitfield's hand, with genuine relief, across the dinner table in September. Her father, who had 3 daughters and 1 struggling tobacco allotment, and the kind of hope that men developed when a good match appeared out of a difficult season. She put the ledger back exactly where she'd found it. She went to the kitchen and helped Mrs. Fenton prepare supper and said nothing about anything. Oliver returned from Lynchburg on Wednesday evening. He was a tall man, fair-haired, with the careful manners of someone who had been raised to make good impressions and had become so practiced at it that the impressions had started to substitute for the thing itself. He was not dishonest, she had decided, so much as he was a man who had learned to lead with the best version of the numbers and wait for the situation to improve before showing the rest. She watched him at dinner and tried to decide if she was angry. She was something. She wasn't entirely sure yet what to call it. How was Lynchburg? She asked. Productive, he said. And then, because he was not a man who elaborated unless pressed, he picked up his fork and turned to the question of the beef. Beatrice ate her dinner and thought about the second ledger. The thing she understood by Thursday morning was that she had 2 choices. She could treat the hidden ledger as a thing that wasn't her business, a husband's private accounting, a matter he would resolve in his own time, and she could manage the household on the fictional numbers, and wait for the gap to announce itself in some unpleasant future emergency. Or she could say something. Neither choice was comfortable. The first was the one her mother would have made. Her mother had spent 30 years making the comfortable choice, and the result was a household that ran on appearances and a woman who had forgotten, somewhere around 1870, what she actually thought about anything. Beatrice was 24 years old. She had not yet forgotten. She found Oliver in the study on Thursday evening, going through correspondence with the focused expression of a man who was hoping not to be interrupted. She closed the door behind her. He looked up. "I need to speak with you," she said. He set down the letter. His expression shifted through something that she couldn't read yet. She was still learning his face, still cataloging the distance between his social expressions and his real ones. "All right. I found the second ledger," she said. "The one behind the other one on the lower shelf." The room went very quiet, not dramatically quiet. Oliver Whitfield was not a dramatic man, but the quality of the silence changed, became occupied with something he was deciding. "When?" he said. "Tuesday." He looked at his desk for a moment. "I should have put it somewhere less obvious." "You should have told me before the wedding," she said. Those are different problems, but that one is the more important one. He was quiet again. She waited. She had learned, in 24 years of living with her father, that men sometimes needed a moment of silence before they could get to the honest thing, and that filling the silence prematurely produced only defensiveness and delay. The Harrow notes, Oliver said finally, came due earlier than I'd projected. And the season before last the yield was. I've read the ledger, Beatrice said. I understand the how of it. I'm asking about the why. Why did you let my father believe the numbers were different from what they were? He looked at her then, really looked, with the expression of a man who had been expecting anger, and had received instead something more difficult to manage. A clear, direct question requiring a clear, direct answer. Because if I had shown him the real numbers, he said, he would not have agreed to the match. That's honest, she said. It's not a defense. No, she said, it isn't. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she had not been invited to do, and he did not say anything about it. I need to know the full extent of it, not the summary. Everything. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out the second ledger, and placed it on the desk between them without being asked. And that small, unperformed gesture, was the first genuinely honest thing she had seen from him, and she registered it carefully the way she registered everything. 2 notes, he said. Coming due in March, the Harrow Bank and a private arrangement with a man named Caldwell in Roanoke. There is also the matter of the South Pasture, which I signed over as security 2 years ago without. He stopped. Without telling anyone, she said. Without telling anyone. She opened the ledger and started reading. He sat across from her and said nothing, which was to his credit, and after 40 minutes she set it down and looked at the window. The Mercer property, she said. The 40 acres on the creek side that your grandfather left you. You haven't worked it in 3 seasons, no. Caldwell would take it. You said last month at the Baxter dinner that he's been after it for years. Oliver was very still. You remember that. I was sitting across from you, she said. I remember most things. She looked back at the ledger. Selling the Mercer acreage settles the Caldwell note and gives you enough margin to service the Harrow note through spring. If you reduce the household staff by 1 and don't take on any new agreements until fall. She paused. The South Pasture situation is more complicated, and will require a conversation with someone who knows the original terms better than I can read from this. She closed the ledger. That is manageable, she said. It requires honesty and some uncomfortable conversations. But it is manageable. Oliver looked at her across the desk with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude. She had seen his gratitude, and it looked like relief, which was its own problem. This was something different. The expression of a man encountering, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of being seen accurately and not flinched from. Beatrice, he said. Don't, she said. Don't explain it further tonight. I need some time. She stood, put the ledger back on the desk between them, and walked to the door. Then she stopped. I am not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that. This marriage is what it is, and I have not decided to undo it. But we are going to do this correctly going forward, with real numbers, all of them. She went to bed. She did not sleep for some time. What she thought about, in the dark of Oliver Whitfield's house, was her younger sister Constance. Constance was 19. She was the kind of beautiful that their mother called a gift, and their father called a responsibility, and she was currently being considered for a match with a man named Hartley in Fredericksburg, the details of which Beatrice had heard in the careful, edited version her mother provided in letters. The Hartley family is well regarded. His character is considered sound. His prospects are. Beatrice did not know what his prospects actually were. She had not known what Oliver's actual prospects were. She had not thought to ask, because she had been 23 and newly arrived in a situation she had not chosen, and doing the thing that grateful daughter did, which was accept the version of events that kept everything smooth. She was not going to let Constance do that. She wrote the letter on Friday morning, before Oliver came down to breakfast. It was not a short letter, and it was not the kind of letter she would have written a month ago, when she was still trying to determine what shape she was supposed to hold in this household. She wrote it as herself, which was a Beatrice she was still in the process of recovering, and she wrote plainly, which was the only way she had ever known how to write when the thing mattered. She told Constance to ask for the second ledger. Not in those words, exactly, but she wrote, "Before you agree to anything, ask to see the household accounts yourself. Not the summary, the actual books. A man who has nothing to hide will hand them over without making it into an occasion. A man who hesitates will tell you everything you need to know by the nature of his hesitation. She sealed the letter and gave it to the postboy herself. Her mother's letter arrived on Saturday. It was the kind of a letter her mother had been writing for 30 years, smooth and arranged, and full of the useful kind of love that functioned primarily as social management. Her mother's letters always made her feel simultaneously cared for and slightly diminished, the way a well-fitted coat that was nonetheless cut for a different body felt. It covered you. It was not quite yours. This letter said, among other managed things, that Constance's situation with the Hartley family was progressing very favorably, and that a response from Beatrice expressing enthusiasm would be the sort of sisterly support that could do a great deal of good. Beatrice did not write a letter expressing enthusiasm. She was in the parlor on Saturday afternoon, thinking about how to respond to her mother, when Oliver appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had decided to do something uncomfortable and was going to do it before he lost the nerve. "I've written to Caldwell," he said. She looked up. "About the Mercer property." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I asked whether he would take it in settlement of the note. I told him the terms I could offer." He paused. "I did not try to improve the numbers first." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. He was 31 years old, and he had a careful face, and he had been raised to make good impressions, and he was standing in the doorway of his own parlor, turning his hat in his hands like a man who was not entirely sure he was welcome, which was, she realized, probably accurate. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Oliver said. "Specifically, she studied him. That must have been uncomfortable, very." A pause. "He's agreed to consider it. He'll send his man Monday." She nodded. "Then, sit down." He sat across from her, and she looked at him. The real look, not the assessing one she'd been giving him for 3 weeks, cataloging impressions. The honest look. "The Hartley match," she said. "For my sister." Oliver frowned slightly. "I don't know much about it. Your mother mentioned it at the wedding. I need you to find out what you can," she said. "His actual circumstances. Not the Fredericksburg social version, the real one." He held her gaze. "Why?" "Because my sister is 19. Beatrice said, and she has been raised to be grateful for the match she's offered rather than particular about what she's walking into. And I am not going to let her walk into what I walked into, without at least trying to give her better information." Something moved across Oliver's face. Not quite a flinch, not quite shame, something that lived between them and was looking for where to land. "What you walked into, I am not relitigating the ledger," she said. "I am dealing with the ledger. What I'm telling you now is that I need your help with my sister, and I am asking directly, which is how I intend to ask for things going forward." He was quiet. "I can write to Baxter," he said finally. "He knows the Hartley family. He'd give me an honest account if I asked correctly." "Ask correctly," she said. He almost did something with his mouth that might have been the beginning of something real more than his usual careful expressions. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm trying to decide if that's your failing or mine." "Probably mine," he said, without hesitation, which surprised her. She looked at him a moment longer, then she picked up her needlework, which she had no intention of doing, and said, "Write to Baxter today, before dinner." He left to write the letter. Baxter's response came Wednesday. Oliver brought it to her in the garden, where she was cutting the last of the fall roses. And he stood at the edge of the path and read it to her without being asked to, which was also a thing she noted and filed away. The Hartley circumstances were not what Constance's situation had been described as. The property in Fredericksburg was encumbered. The elder Hartley had died, leaving matters in a condition that the son was still attempting to resolve. The son himself, Philip Hartley, 27, was considered by Baxter to be a man of decent character who was navigating a difficult inheritance with more patience than sense, which Baxter meant kindly but which meant, in plain terms, that he was a man hoping a good match would stabilize a situation that required more fundamental repair. Oliver folded the letter and looked at her. "My sister," Beatrice said, "is going to hear this directly. Your mother," he said carefully, "will not receive that well." "My mother," Beatrice said, "has arranged her life around what people receive well. And the result is a daughter who nearly walked into a financially distressed household without knowing it." She set down the roses. "No offense intended. I'm not owed," he said. She went inside and wrote the second letter to Constance. This one was shorter. She set out the Hartley circumstances as Baxter had described them, without commentary, without her opinion of Philip Hartley's character one way or another. Because she didn't have enough information to have that opinion, and she knew the difference between not knowing something and performing certainty about it. She wrote, "Here is what I know. Here is what I don't know. Here is what you should ask before you decide. she wrote. The asking is the thing. Don't let anyone make you feel that asking is ungrateful or suspicious. A man who will share his life with you should be willing to share his books. She sealed it and went back to the garden, and picked up the roses, and did not look at Oliver, who was still standing at the edge of the path with the letter in his hand. You're going to make an enemy of your mother, he said. I've had one for years, Beatrice said. I just didn't know what to call her. He was quiet for a moment, then, can I ask you something? Yes, the night I came back from Lynchburg, he said. When you already knew about the ledger. You didn't say anything at dinner. No, why not? She considered the question the way she considered everything, without performing the answer before she'd actually found it. Because I needed to understand the shape of it first, she said. And because I wanted to see what you would do when you didn't know I knew. Whether you would say anything on your own. He was very still. And you didn't, she said. Which told me something. But you also didn't lie when I asked directly. Which told me something else. What did it tell you? That you are a man who avoids hard things until he can't avoid them anymore, she said. And that when he can't avoid them anymore, he doesn't compound the problem by lying. That's not a glowing character reference, but it's not a disqualification either. He looked at her with the expression she had been trying to name for a week. Direct, and carrying something beneath the directness that he hadn't yet decided to say aloud. I did not show you the real numbers, he said, because I was afraid you would refuse. I know, I have regretted it since the week after the wedding, he said. Not strategically, actually. I know that too, she said. The letter to Caldwell told me. He looked at the roses in her hands. What would you have done, if you had known, before the wedding? She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I don't know, she said. I might have refused, I might have asked questions that led somewhere different. I can't tell you what I would have decided with better information, because I didn't have it. She looked at him. That's the thing about hiding the numbers, Oliver. You didn't take away my answer, you took away my choice. He heard it. She could tell by the way his expression went still, and then settled into something that was not comfortable but was true. Yes, he said. I did. Don't do it again, she said. I won't. She handed him half the roses, without planning to, the way you handed someone something when your hands were full, and they were standing there, and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. He took them. They stood in the garden in the late October light, which was the particular gold of a Virginia fall, the kind of light that made everything look more settled than it was. And she thought about Constance's letter, and the Hartley situation, and her mother's smooth, careful management, and the second ledger on the shelf, and she thought about the specific arithmetic of a life assembled on incomplete information. She was not going to do that. Whatever this became, this household, this marriage, this man still learning how to hand her the real numbers. She was going to know the actual figures, all of them, the ones that were comfortable and the ones that weren't. That was not romantic, she knew that, but she had come to believe. In the 3 weeks since she had found the ledger and sat with what it meant and decided what she intended to do about it, that honesty was a better foundation than romance. Romance was the dress someone else had chosen. Honesty was the thing that was entirely hers. Constance wrote back on a Friday. 2 weeks later, the letter was 3 pages, which was not what Beatrice had expected. Constance was not a 3-page letter writer. She was the kind of young woman who expressed herself in full sentences spoken aloud and brief charming notes, and the 3 pages meant something had shifted. She had asked Philip Hartley to show her the household accounts. She had not used those words exactly. She had asked, cleverly, through the mechanism of expressing interest in the management of things, in a way that her mother had apparently interpreted as Constance performing appropriate wifely interest, to see how the Fredericksburg property was organized. Philip Hartley had shown her, not a summary, the actual books. He had done it, Constance wrote, without hesitation, without making it into an occasion. He had handed them over and then stood beside her and explained the Fredericksburg situation in plain terms, including the parts that were not resolved and the timeline he expected for resolving them. He had said, and Constance had underlined this twice, I won't ask you to walk into something you haven't seen clearly. Then he had asked her what she thought, and waited for the answer. Beatrice read this 3 times. Then she read the part where Constance said, I think I want to know him better, not the match. Him. The person who did that without being cornered into it. She folded the letter and held it in her lap for a moment. Oliver found her there when he came in from the fields, still holding the letter, looking at nothing in particular. Good news or complicated news? He asked. Good news, she said. Delivered in a form that makes me think about things. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the sideboard and looked at her. They had developed, in the weeks since the study conversation, a kind of working ease that was not yet warmth but was moving in that direction. He asked real questions. She gave real answers. He had reduced the household staff by one, as she'd suggested, and had the conversation with the Harrow Bank himself, and reported back with the actual terms rather than a softened version. Small things, the kind that added up. Constance asked to see Hartley's accounts, Beatrice said. Oliver looked up. He showed her, she said, without being asked twice. He was quiet for a moment. Good man, he said simply. Apparently, she looked at the letter. He said he wouldn't ask her to walk into something she hadn't seen clearly. She felt Oliver hear it. He was still, and his face did something she had come to recognize as the expression he made when a thing landed that he needed to sit with. No, he said finally. I suppose he wouldn't. It's a different kind of man, she said, not cruelly, as an observation. I know, he said. I know what kind of man I was. He set down the water glass. I am trying to be a different one. I don't expect that to count for much yet. She looked at him. 24 years old. And she had spent those years being the useful daughter, the practical one, the one who kept the household accounts no one else wanted to look at. And she had come into this marriage already knowing how to manage on incomplete information, because incomplete information was what she had always been given. She was tired of that. It counts for something, she said. Not everything, but something. He nodded once and went to wash up for dinner, and she sat with Constance's letter and felt the specific shape of what she had done. She had sent 2 letters into an uncertain situation, with no guarantee that either would be received the way she meant them. She had told her sister to ask the question that might have collapsed the match, or changed it, or revealed something that would make Constance walk away. She had done it without her mother's knowledge, without her father's instruction, against the operating assumption of her entire upbringing, which was that a young woman's job was to receive the version of events she was offered, and find a way to be grateful for it. She had decided she did not believe that. She had decided it in a study on a Tuesday afternoon holding a hidden ledger, and she had not unmade the decision since. The Caldwell matter resolved in November. Oliver's man rode down to deliver the paperwork on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday the Mercer acreage was Caldwell's, and the note was settled, and Oliver came to find her in the kitchen, where she was working through the week's household accounts, and he stood in the doorway and said, "It's done." She looked up. "The margin?" "Enough," he said. "More than I told you it would be, because Caldwell added an incentive for speed." "We are." He stopped, and she saw him choosing between the comfortable version and the other one, and she watched him choose the other one. "We have approximately 4 months of solid footing before the Harrow note comes due in March. If the winter is decent and I sell the timber rights on the north pasture, we carry through to spring planting." "That's honest," she said. "I am working on it," he said. She looked at him. "The timber rights. Have you spoken to Jennings about the rate?" "Not yet." "Speak to Jennings before you speak to anyone else," she said. "He lowballs if you let him lead. Go in with the Baxter acreage rate from last fall as your floor, and don't move from it in the first conversation." Oliver looked at her the way he had started looking at her lately, with a quality of attention that was different from the polite interest of the first weeks. Something more direct. Something that paid attention not to the impression she made, but to the actual thing she was saying. "How do you know the Baxter rate?" he asked. "Your dinner conversation in September," she said. "Before the wedding. You mentioned it to my father when you were explaining the North County timber market." He was quiet for a moment. "You remember that? I was sitting across from you," she said. "I remember most things." He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, which he had not done before. The kitchen was Mrs. Fenton's territory, and Oliver had respected that in the way of a man who respected boundaries without much examining where they came from. But he sat down now, in Mrs. Fenton's kitchen, in November, and he looked at the household account book open on the table between them. "Can I see?" he asked. She turned the book toward him. He read for several minutes. She watched him read. The careful expression, the slight movement at the jaw when something surprised him, the still point when he was absorbing a number he hadn't known. She had been running this household on his presented figures for 6 weeks, and she had made it work, which was the thing she had always done with whatever she was given. "You reduced the candle expenditure," he said. "You were over-ordering," she said. Mrs. Fenton didn't like to say so. "And the grain order. The mill in Charlottesville has better rates than the one your family has used for 30 years, she said. "I wrote to them in October. We save $11 per quarter." He looked up from the book. He had the expression again. The one she had been trying to name for weeks, and had finally decided was simply the expression of a man who was paying honest attention, which was a thing she had not often been the object of, and which she was still learning to receive without deflecting. "Beatrice," he said. "Don't thank me for doing arithmetic," she said. "I wasn't going to thank you," he said. "I was going to say that I have spent 6 weeks watching you run this household on numbers I gave you, that were not complete. And you made it work, and I don't know if you understand that I understand the full measure of what that means." She looked at him. "I gave you the wrong tools," he said. "And you built something with them anyway." "I've always had the wrong tools," she said. "I've had practice." He heard that. She saw him hear it. The thing underneath the thing she'd said, the history in it, the 24 years of being handed incomplete information, and being expected to make it function, the whole long pattern of it. "I should have given you the right ones," he said, "before the wedding. Or immediately after. I should have." He stopped. "There is no version of this where I performed well at the beginning." "No," she said. "There isn't. But I can perform better now," he said. "If you..." He stopped again, and she realized he was not sure of the footing, not sure what she would accept, and that the uncertainty was real and not performed. "Say it plainly," she said. "If you will actually work with me," he said, "not manage around me. Actually work with me. The accounts, the timber, the March situation, all of it. I don't have the right word, partners," she said. "It's the right word." He was quiet. "I know if I know how to do that." "I know," she said. "We'll figure it out." She turned the account book back toward herself and picked up her pen. And he stayed sitting across from her at the kitchen table in Mrs. Fenton's domain on a November morning, and the house went on around them in the ordinary way that houses did, indifferent to whatever was being decided in the kitchen. Constance came in December, for 3 weeks over Christmas, and the household that received her was different from the one Beatrice had entered in October. Not transformed. 3 months did not transform a household, but different, more honest, the kind of different that came from two people deciding, mostly without discussion, and mostly through the accumulation of small daily decisions, that the real version of things was more worth having than the comfortable one. Constance noticed immediately, because Constance noticed everything, and she said nothing about it for the first 2 days. And then on the third evening after Oliver had gone to his study, she sat across from Beatrice in the parlor and said, "Tell me what happened." "What do you mean?" "You are different," Constance said. "The house is different. He is different, or maybe just different than what I expected." "What happened?" Beatrice thought about the second ledger, about the kitchen table, about the letter to Caldwell and the Baxter rates and the candle expenditure, and the $11 per quarter from the Charlottesville mill. "I found the real numbers," she said, "and decided to work with them instead of around them." Constance studied her. "Are you happy?" Beatrice considered it the way the question deserved. "I'm clear," she said. "I know what I have and I know what I'm working with, and I know what kind of man he is trying to be. Whether that becomes something more is a different question, and I'm not in a hurry to answer it." "That sounds like you," Constance said. "Hardly," Beatrice said. "Tell me," Constance told her. He had written twice. The second letter had been longer than the first, and honest in the way the account books had been honest. Not flattering, not performing, just direct. He had said he understood she needed time to decide. He had said he would still be in Fredericksburg when she had decided, and that the books would be available for review if she wanted to look again, and that he meant both things. "That's a man who learned something from the first conversation," Beatrice said. "I know," Constance said. "That's why I'm writing back." Beatrice looked at her sister, 19 years old and beautiful and considerably wiser than she had been at 19, partly because their mother had managed them both, and partly because of 2 letters in October that had given her different instructions. "Write back," Beatrice said, "and keep asking the real questions." "I will," Constance said. "You taught me how." Oliver appeared in the parlor doorway later that evening, and Beatrice looked at him from across the room, with the particular quality of attention she had been developing since November. The honest look that did not try to make him into something he was not, or diminish him into something he was no longer becoming. He was a man who had hidden a ledger and had chosen, when cornered, not to compound it. Who had written to Caldwell with accurate numbers and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and asked to see the accounts she had been keeping for his house. He was not the man she would have chosen. She was practical enough to know she would not have chosen a man at 24 in Virginia, in 1887, from a position of full information. Because full information was not a thing women were generally offered, and she was still, on some days, quietly furious about that. But he was learning to offer it now. He was standing in the doorway of his parlor in December, with the wood smoke from the fire doing what it did to the late evening air, and he was looking at her with the careful attention of a man who was still learning to see her clearly, and was committed to the effort. Jennings agreed to the floor rate, he said. The timber rights are settled. She felt Constance very carefully, not looking at either of them. Good, Beatrice said. Come in. He came in. He sat in the chair, across from where she was sitting, not beside her. Still the right distance, for two people who were learning the geography of each other honestly, without shortcuts. And Constance made a reason to be elsewhere very shortly after, with the grace of a young woman who had been raised to manage social situations, and had recently discovered that certain situations did not need to be managed, only allowed to continue. The South Pasture, Beatrice said. I spoke to the solicitor in Lynchburg, Oliver said. It's going to take longer than I wanted, but it's solvable. Tell me the terms. He told her the terms, the real ones, all of them. She listened and asked 3 questions, and made one suggestion that he considered for a moment, and then agreed with. And the fire burned down slightly, and the house was quiet around them, except for the sound of Constance in the kitchen with Mrs. Fenton, doing something unnecessary with the tea things to give them time. It was not a romantic evening. It was not the kind of evening that got told as a story later, with the soft details and the particular glow that retrospect put on things. It was 2 people in a parlor in December, working through a problem with the real numbers on the table between them. It was, Beatrice thought, the best evening she had spent in this house. Not because the problem was solved. It wasn't, not entirely. The March note was still coming. The South Pasture situation had weeks left to resolve. The household was solid but not settled, and would not be settled for some time, and she knew that clearly. But she was working with the real numbers. He was giving her the real numbers. And the life assembling itself around that practice, imperfect, honest, still in the early stages of becoming itself, was entirely hers, not borrowed, not arranged by someone else's hand, for someone else's comfort, hers. She had not come to this marriage with expectations of warmth. She had come with her own arithmetic and her mother's hopes and a dress someone else had chosen, and she had found the second ledger and decided what she intended to do with it. And what she had built with those materials was not what anyone had planned for her. It was better than that. It was real.